Good. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Felicia Shaw. I'm the Executive Director of the Regional Arts Commission of St. Louis. So let's do this again. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. That's what I'm talking about. This is really important because the man that I'm about to introduce this afternoon is accustomed to people speaking up and speaking out. He's not afraid of a little audience participation, a little call and response, because the person you're about to meet is a man of wonderful words and action. So I first met our next speaker a little less than 2 years ago. I had just returned to St. Louis to head up the Regional Arts Commission as its new executive director. I'd been gone from my home for a very long time, 34 years, but it took the Ferguson uprising to call me home. He was one of the first people to reach out to me to hear the story of this crazy woman who left the comfort of sunny San Diego to return to St. Louis, one of the most racially segregated communities in the country, so full of stress and strife, with Michael Brown's murder still very much on everyone's mind. So I told him that I had answered a personal calling to return to St. Louis, a place that had given me so much, but I had given so little. And that in the wake of the Ferguson uprising, it was time for me to give something back, to make a personal sacrifice and help St. Louis deal with this long history of racism, which is why I left so many years ago and had vowed never to return. Of course, at 17, you know everything, right? Okay. So he listened quietly and politely to my story about how I had said in San Diego when my Twitter feed was blowing up and I was watching young men and women jumping out of stores, looting, and how embarrassed I really was at that time. Oh my God, looting and going crazy. And he listened to my story about how I then began to listen to their story and became saddened and angered that so much that it was going on there was going on when I lived there 35 years ago. And then he listened to the story of how I began to feel quite guilty, and that was my last feeling, guilty that I had left a community that had given me so much, and perhaps if people like me had stayed, Ferguson never would have happened. So he listened quietly and politely, and he let me get through the whole story. I was feeling really good about myself, and I was expecting applause, but I got none from him. And he leaned back after he listened to my story, and he said, "Good. Now, let's get busy. We have work to do." Because while our next speaker loves a good story and can tell a few good stories of himself, because after all, he is a preacher, people who know him will tell you that he spends more time walking the walk than talking the talk. What impresses Reverend Starsky Wilson is action. A preacher, a philanthropist, and an activist, Reverend Wilson does not shy away from controversy or hard work. Appointed by the governor of Missouri to co-chair the Ferguson Commission, he answered the call to shepherd the community through the hard work of uncovering the painful truths that led to the unrest. The report he and others delivered to the community included nearly 200 calls to action. A lot of bad in St. Louis needed to get fixed. And today, because of his tireless leadership, I believe that St. Louis is truly on the path towards racial equity. So he's here today, I think, because he's really one of us. He understands the power of grant making to incentivize change, and he understands the power of the arts to speak our truths and bring people together in ways that nothing else can. I thank him for understanding that real and lasting community change often begins at the intersection of art and social justice. So you can read about him in your program, but you're going to enjoy hearing his story even more. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Starsky Wilson to the stage.
Good afternoon. It's really great for us to be here, and I'm absolutely delighted to be among you. Thank you for having me. I try not to go into these spaces without bringing a few friends, without bringing a few images. So on this screen over here, you're going to see some of my friends. Also, I recognize the limitation of the spoken word, at least from my own voice, and so I think it's appropriate to bring some images of the uprising, of the response, and of those who have been engaged, of the creation, the context, and the culture developed by the hands of artists, craftsmen, organizers, activists, and advocates. And so you'll see those on the screen over there. So if you get tired of looking at a brother, there are better images there anyway. I want to thank the team for from Grantmakers in the Arts, for the board, for the staff who have invited me to be with you. First, for the invitation. Second, for your tireless leadership in the area of racial equity and philanthropy. I had the occasion to sit at tables with Grantmakers for Effective Organizations, with the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, and just over the course of the last week with the D5 Coalition, wrestling with these issues. And at each of them, we have great regard and respect for the work that Grantmakers in the Arts has been doing and the leadership that you have provided. So I want to thank you for that work and invite you to applaud those who have led that work, like Maureen and Janet and others. I've come here today. First, I got to do a little bit of a crowd check. For the artists, if you were an artist in the room, would you please raise your hand? Artists in the room. All right, hands down. If you work in philanthropy, the philanthropists in the room, please raise your hand. Thank you very much. Who raised their hand twice? Thank you. I've come to agitate the rest of the room. I come to tell you about the story of my own re-baptism that occurred on Indigenous Peoples Day, October 13th, 2014. That Monday was the end, the closing day of actions for what was called Ferguson October. On Ferguson October, clergy gathered in order to lead a series of actions in the morning. And that would be followed by actions all day in different areas throughout the region. We were blessed by the presence of more than 10,000 people who came from all over the United States to amplify the voices of those who have been crying out since August 10th, 2014, including young people, artists as well, who gathered around and saw lying there the body of Michael Brown in the middle of the street in the Canfield Green apartment. And we received the support of those who came in. And on Monday morning, clergy gathered at Wellspring Church in order to go forth out into the streets and lead a day of actions. Now, I lead a foundation. And, these kind of actions, they kind of come up without a whole lot of warning. We plan committee meetings like a year ahead of time. And nobody asked me if my executive committee meeting was going to happen that morning, but it had to. Nobody asked whether the staff meeting we have every Monday morning was going to happen, but it had to. So after the executive committee meeting and before the staff meeting, I had a decision to make. Was I that day going to be a philanthropist or an artist engaged in the public acts of activism, the creation of a culture and a context through public display that would invite people to this moment of discomfort and invite people to query whether they should change? So at the beginning of the staff meeting, I sat there and I looked around at the staff, and being the CEO, I could make this decision. I decided that we weren't going to have staff meeting that day, that there was work to be done elsewhere and art to be created. I was called to participate in the creation and the crafting of a context and a culture whereby people thought differently and wrestled with certain questions. So I canceled the staff meeting and went to Wellspring Church. There at Wellspring, I caught up. I didn't get the training. I probably should have been there for the training. But it was going on during the executive committee meeting. I got there in time to make it just as people were processing into the streets. And because I am a preacher, one who engages in the kind of artistry and the culture creation that Mark Chaves of Duke University talks about when he suggests that it is in congregations in America whereby the most significant, regular, and consistent production of culture happens, when people engage in performance art on a regular basis in liturgy, where they produce art in bulletins and programs, and they don't think of it in a high manner, and many of us do not, but there are certain forms that come with it. And so I couldn't just go out there. I needed my costume. I was dressed as a philanthropist that day, not as a preacher. And so I remembered that there was an old stole back in the closet at the foundation. So I grabbed the stole. And I found there gathered those who had on collars and those who had on robes and those who had on stoles. And we led out together in what seemed to be an overcast day that later became pouring rain. There, as we got together in our costumes, we went down marching in the street, and we made our way to the Ferguson Police Department. It wasn't operating at the time, Janet. It was shut down because they were building a bigger police department. They needed more cell space to hoard and hold people. But there were police officers there. It did become a symbol of our actions and a place where we gathered for resistance. And so we gathered there. We stood there and decided we'd create some more art. And so in what has become a regularly reproduced public art installation, we engaged in a die-in. Lying in the middle of the street there before the Ferguson Police Department, Pastor Charles Burden laid himself down, and with candles lit around him, someone took chalk and began to draw and outline his body, leaving behind a visual representation of the relative position that younger black men like Pastor Burden find themselves in. In that space, and I had to challenge myself on this because, there's a difference between accuracy and truth. I don't know, because it began as a silent march, whether it is accurate that K.B. Frazier's drum was drumming. K.B., a trans person, a member of Central Reform congregation whose drum came to me to be the heartbeat of the movement. I don't know accurately whether KB's drum was drumming, but in truth, I can't be in those spaces without KB's drum. And so I hear still KB's drum. And I hear the chants, and I hear the question of Dr. C.T. Vivian, what kind of music, what kind of songs do you all sing down here in Ferguson? Because when the music stops, the movement stops. I'm glad that day that over 4.5 hours, with rain that began to pour down, through waves of arrests, I decided to go be with the activists, the artists, because I was reborn that day. In that moment before there was a Ferguson Commission, in that moment before the governor decided he was going to do something, many of us were baptized into a new reality in life. I very intentionally, recognizing the context of diversity, I very intentionally use the word baptized. And not to make anyone uncomfortable, I did grow up in the South in a Baptist church as one who went to church all the time. And in the church that I went to, baptism meant having one's whole body immersed in water and then being brought back up. And it symbolized a newness of life. I have come later to recognize in my study of interreligious traditions that most things in Christianity we borrowed, straight up jacked, from our big brothers and sisters in radical monotheism in the Jewish tradition. And it is modeled on a concept called the mikveh, a ritual washing for religious purpose. I was there washed for a new purpose. And because I recall this from this old Baptist church tradition whereby you are baptized through full immersion, then it couldn't be that my thoughts changed and my preaching changed, but my philanthropy didn't change. I was fully immersed, and the way I do the work at the foundation had to change as well. It helps me because I believe if we will in philanthropy, which can be art and science, in philanthropy, which can be mission and management, if we will choose to be artists, then our work must be informed by proximity. And so my relationships with Alexis and Damon Davis, he who created the Hands Up art project that became to be installed all over Ferguson, my conversations with him at midnight as we marched together to St. Louis University's campus for that gathering where at midnight people overtook the clock tower. If I was going to do the work well, I had to be in those spaces. If we will choose art, our work must be informed by proximity, but it must also be aimed at equity. I am grateful that my colleagues on the Ferguson Commission decided that it was appropriate for our entire orientation, for those 189 recommendations and calls to action, to be aimed at racial equity. I was glad that my deeply committed conservative colleague who's older than I and who has a different political orientation than I went along with the journey when learning and listening to more than 3,000 citizens of the community who gave more than 30,000 volunteer hours to give their hopes and their dreams for community together. Said that what we need is we need to move forward through these matters. And we need to forge a path toward racial equity. This is the issue. I was glad he went along with those early words that said, this is about race. We know it's not comfortable. We know people don't like to talk about it, but we find ourselves in this place because of our history of race. I am reminded as I think of my baptism that we all got these issues. I know, I hang out with some progressive people. I know this is a relatively progressive group, probably more progressive than the people I hang out with. And I know folk believe they have made it through these issues and they operate in institutions that have come so through these matters. But this is the deal. We're not far from Indigenous Peoples Day this year, and if you live in a land and operate in institutions that have been built based upon land that got jacked and labor that got forced, then you got issues with racial equity too. And so, if philanthropy will be art, and it will continue to be social venture capital for social change, then it must be aimed at equity. Parallel life circumstances and outcomes for people no matter where they live, where they come from, how many times their skin has been kissed by God's Son. It must be aimed at equity. I was glad that those young people who gathered at Art Speak, participating in the process of the Ferguson Commission, as they used expressions of art, visual, spoken, created, public, all to tell us what they wanted for their region. And they pointed toward equity. I was glad to know that when we convened and we had to tell our story, that our communications folk, the good storytellers who were doing work with us reminded us that you can put out a report if you want to. But you know what happens to these reports, don't you? Dust, shelf. Bring them back out when we got another issue. See what we said the last time. So I was glad that people noted that we should put this report up on a digital platform, forwardthroughferguson.org, by the way, and that anything that is printed is only a complement, a supplement to the report. But when you go to that website, the real report also includes more than 70 stories of people. Those engaged through Humans of St. Louis, a digital storytelling platform where people had the occasion and opportunity to say, this is how these policies of the courts and these policies of police impact me every single day. You don't get what's going on without the griot. And so the griots who were gathering people's stories in Ferguson helped us to round out an articulation of people's hopes by saying how they were impacted by these issues. We were able to choose art because artists were working to gather people's stories and amplify them. The griot was doing her work. If we're going to choose art, our work must be informed by proximity. It must be aimed at equity, but it's also got to be shifting policy. One of the things we had to do, because it's art, not science, I never found this in any training I ever went to on philanthropy. They never told me that I needed to hang out with organizers. They never told me that chasing the root causes meant that I would find myself in dangerous places. They never told me that. They talked to me a lot about working with the established leaders in communities, so I figured maybe working with the mayor is something I should do, and working with the police chief sometimes goes with working with the mayor. They never told me I might have to side against both of those, because when you find yourself in dangerous places, the mayor and the police chief have access to tear gas. By the way, the tear gas that was used on us was expired. That they have access to tear gas, and they may use it on you if you find yourself with proximity to people who challenge these structures. What they also didn't say was that some of those people are artists too. So what I found when Deaconess Foundation recognized that we would continue to push this agenda by gathering an organizing table, a table of people who work in institutions like Jobs with Justice and the Organization for Black Struggle and Missourians Organizing for Reform and Empowerment. When we began to gather those folk, we recognized that they knew each other. Not because they're institutions that work together, but because they had done stuff together. How do y'all know each other? Oh, we met 20 years ago. What? 20 years? Yeah, we were in this program together. Community Artist Training Program. They didn't actually say that. What they said was, we're cats. That they met together as artists, engaging and learning about organizing together, that the creative impulse whereby they came to develop and craft a culture of tension and resistance so that the community could be held long enough to make change happen in an art institution. If we're going to choose art, then we must invest in the development of those artists and the skill sets that continue to advance their work. Y'all know this. I'm preaching to the choir, but I'm a preacher. That's what I do. I'm going to come back to this because I think this is the challenge for each and every one of us. It is balancing the art and the science. As we advance through careers, I'm told there are a number of program officers here, and increasingly people will invite you to learn more about the science. Go to conferences where you can study about the calibration between long-term grants and project grants, between operating support and project support, organizational capacity, community capacity, collective impact programs and approaches, and all of these different kinds of, they will teach you the management and the science, and you still got to find a way to choose art. Choose art. Choose art because art is adaptive and it helps us with the realities that we're dealing with today. A brother by the name of Ronald Heifetz talks about leadership without easy answers. And it begins with this premise that all the easy problems have been resolved. If I wasn't in front of a whole lot of people in a professional setting, I'd say, ain't no more. Ain't no more easy. Easy been gone. Easy turn the lights out. Y'all came in and turned them back on. Because there ain't no more easy, Ron Heifetz says we have adaptive challenges, those that require learning. What I say all the time is that there were two leadership responsibilities to happen in Ferguson. The first responsibility of the leader in times of crisis with an adaptive challenge is to hold the tension long enough so that people understand and know that they have to make a change. The second is to invite them to a community table whereby they might engage in the actual learning required to make the change. The commission folk, we get lauded, we get applauded. The philanthropists, we get that kind of stuff. But the reality is, without the context that is created by the artists who produce these images that invite people from across the nation, because Ferguson is in their hometown, then that governor never sits down to sign that executive order that then creates a space for the community to articulate its hope for equity. But that happens when folk decide to choose art rather than science. So I invite you. I come to agitate you to blur the lines. The next time they ask you, are you a philanthropist? Yes. When they ask you, are you an artist? Yes. Begin with the articulation and own the distance between articulation, aspiration, and actuality. Yes, there has been a challenging, deep, well thought out articulation and even call and challenge to Grantmakers in the arts to invest in racial equity. Oh, but preachers know the difference between the scripture and the sanctuary. Scripture is our articulated aspiration. Let us work to live into it. Let us follow the prophetic works of this board, of this staff, who have called us forth to invest and to engage in equitable outcomes for people. Let us create in the context of the arts the tension whereby others will come learn more and change their behavior. If we do that, then our aspirations and our actuality come together because we have done the difficult work, the hard stuff of choosing art. That is my invitation to you. That is my commitment. So let's do it together. God bless you.